Imagine growing up and knowing deep in your heart that you were different, that the world was waiting for you, but no one around you fully understood why. Now, imagine that for 30 years, almost nothing was written down about your life. No records, no detailed stories, just silence. That is the mystery we are exploring today. The hidden years of Jesus, the childhood and young adult life of the most talked about person in all of human history, and yet the years the Bible says almost nothing about. If you have ever wondered what Jesus was doing before he began his ministry, where he went, what he learned, who shaped him, and why God chose to keep most of it hidden, then stay right here because this story is going to move you deeply. And before we go further, if this is your first time on this channel, welcome. We tell Bible stories here in a way that brings them to life, that makes you feel like you were there. So if that sounds like something you want more of, go ahead and subscribe right now and tap the bell so you never miss a story. All right, let's go back, all the way back, to a small, dusty town that most people had never heard of. Nazareth. It was not a famous place. It was not a city of power or wealth or great learning. It sat quietly in the hills of Galilee, a small, tight-knit community of working people. Farmers, fishermen, carpenters, people who woke up before the sun, worked with their hands all day, and fell asleep tired and grateful. It was here, in this ordinary place, that an extraordinary child was growing up. His name was Jesus, and from the very beginning, there was something different about him, though most people around him had no idea just how different he truly was. His mother, Mary, knew. She carried the weight of a sacred secret in her heart every single day. She had been visited by an angel. She had been told that her son would be called the Son of the Most High, that he would have a kingdom that would never end. She did not fully understand everything that meant, but she remembered. She kept every little thing stored away inside her, turning it over in her mind, holding on to it the way you hold on to something precious, tightly, carefully, afraid to let it go. His earthly father, Joseph, knew too. Joseph was a quiet man, a strong man, a man of deep faith and deep responsibility. He had received his own message from God in a dream, telling him not to be afraid, telling him to take Mary as his wife, telling him that the child she carried was holy. Joseph said yes. He did not hesitate. He stepped into one of the most unusual roles any man has ever been asked to fill, the role of raising the Son of God as his own son. Think about that for a moment. Joseph would wake up every morning and look at this child, this boy with tired eyes and flour on his hand from helping in the kitchen, and no, he was not just any boy. And yet, Joseph had to treat him as if he were. He had to discipline him when necessary, teach him, guide him, show him how to use a hammer, how to measure wood, how to work with patience and precision. Can you imagine the quiet weight of that? And Jesus, little Jesus, was growing, learning, living, watching the world around him with those wide, deep eyes. He would have played in the dusty streets with other children. He would have helped his mother carry water from the well. He would have watched the sun set over the hills and felt something stir inside him that he was perhaps too young to fully name. A pull, a purpose, a knowing. The Bible tells us something very important about this time in his life. It says that Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and with people. That one line, so small, so quiet, is actually one of the most powerful things ever written about his childhood, because it tells us that Jesus did not arrive as a fully formed teacher who already knew everything and needed nothing. He grew, he learned, he developed, just like every child does. And that is beautiful, because it means he truly understands what it feels like to be young and uncertain, to be learning something for the first time, to not have all the answers yet. Now we come to a moment that the Bible does record for us, and it is extraordinary. Jesus was 12 years old. Every year, Joseph and Mary made the long journey from Nazareth to Jerusalem for a festival called Passover. It was one of the most sacred celebrations in Jewish life, a time to remember how God had delivered their ancestors from slavery in Egypt. The entire community would travel together. Families, neighbors, relatives, a great crowd of pilgrims walking the dusty roads toward the holy city, Jerusalem. Even as a boy, Jesus would have felt the energy of that city. The massive stone walls, the crowds, the noise of merchants and animals, and thousands of voices rising and falling. And above everything, the temple, glittering in the sunlight. The house of God, the most sacred place in the world. They celebrated the festival. And then, as they always did, the group began the journey back home to Nazareth. Mary and Joseph were walking with the crowd, surrounded by relatives and friends. Children ran between the adults. Everyone was tired, but full from the celebration. And in the normal noise and movement of a large group traveling together, Mary and Joseph assumed that Jesus was somewhere in the crowd. With cousins, perhaps. With friends his own age. They walked an entire day before they realized he was not with them. Now, before you judge them, understand how these journeys worked. Extended family traveled together. It was common for a 12-year-old boy to walk with older cousins or family friends. The group was enormous. It was not careless to assume he was nearby. It was a completely natural mistake. But when Mary began asking, when she looked around and called his name and no one had seen him, the realization hit her like cold water. He was not there. They turned around immediately and walked all the way back to Jerusalem. A full day back. Then they searched the city. 1 day. 2 days. Can you imagine that feeling? The panic, the prayer, the desperate scanning of every face in every crowd, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. 3 days. For 3 days, they searched. And then, finally, they found him. He was in the temple. Not lost. Not hiding. Not frightened. He was sitting in the middle of a group of teachers, learned men, religious scholars who had spent their entire lives studying the scriptures. And he was asking them questions and answering theirs. And everyone who heard him was astonished, completely and utterly astonished. Not just impressed the way adults are sometimes politely impressed by a clever child. Truly astonished, because the depth of his understanding, the wisdom in his words, was unlike anything they had ever encountered. Mary found him there, in that circle of amazed teachers, and she said to him, and you can hear the mix of relief and emotion in her voice, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been searching for you with great worry." And Jesus looked at her, calm and gentle, and asked something that stopped her cold. "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I had to be in my Father's house?" They did not fully understand what he meant. Not yet, but Mary stored away, just like she always did, tucked it safely in her heart for later. And then Jesus went home with them, back to Nazareth, back to the quiet life, back to the workshop and the daily routine. The Bible says he was obedient to them, that he continued to grow in wisdom and favor. The teachers in the temple who had been amazed by him went back to their studies. The world moved on. And for the next 18 years, from the time Jesus was 12 until the time he was 30, the Bible goes almost completely silent. 18 years of silence. Think about that. 18 years of the life of Jesus. The person more books have been written about than anyone else in history, and we have almost no direct record of them. No gospel writer recorded his daily life. No detailed account survived of what he did, what he said, who he spoke with, or where he traveled during those years. Why? That is the question that has stirred the hearts and minds of people for 2,000 years. Some have tried to fill in the gaps with stories and theories. Some ancient writings, not part of the Bible, claimed all kinds of things about these years. That he traveled to Egypt to study ancient wisdom. That he went to India and learned from Eastern teachers. That he performed miracles as a young boy, bringing clay birds to life or striking down those who wronged him. But these writings came much later and are not considered reliable historical accounts. They read more like legends than truth. The Bible itself says almost nothing. But here's what we can know, based on what the scriptures do tell us, and based on the world Jesus lived in. He lived in Nazareth. He worked as a carpenter alongside Joseph. In those days, the word used for carpenter, tekton in Greek, actually meant something broader than just someone who worked with wood. It meant a craftsman, someone who built things, who repaired things, who worked with their hands to create something useful out of raw material. Jesus would have risen before dawn, eaten a simple breakfast, walked to the workshop, and spent the day cutting, shaping, sanding, fitting pieces together. He would have known the smell of fresh cut wood, the weight of a good tool in his hand, the satisfaction of a job done right. He would have spoken with customers, negotiated prices, dealt with difficult people and easy people and people who did not want to pay what they owed. He would have carried heavy loads and worked in the heat and come home in the evening with tired muscles and dusty skin. He was in every visible way a normal young man in a normal small town. But beneath the surface, something was building. Something was growing that the world could not yet see. There is something deeply intentional about these hidden years. God did not accidentally forget to have someone write down what Jesus was doing. The silence is deliberate, and there are things in it worth paying attention to. Jesus, in those 30 years before his public ministry, was learning what it means to be human, not in a pretend way, in a real, daily, ordinary way. He was learning what it feels like to be tired, to be hungry, to be misunderstood by people who think they know you because they watched you grow up. He was learning what it is to grieve, because Joseph, the man who raised him, is not mentioned after Jesus' childhood. Many scholars believe Joseph passed away sometime during those hidden years, which would have meant Jesus experienced the loss of someone he deeply loved. He was learning patience, learning how to be present with people, how to listen, how to work, how to wait. And the waiting, perhaps that is the most important part, because Jesus knew. He had always known, on some level, what he was here to do. He had told his parents at 12 years old that he had to be in his Father's house. The purpose was inside him like a fire. And yet he waited. He worked. He served his family. He lived a quiet life in a small town for 18 more years before he stepped into the full calling he was born for. That kind of patience is almost incomprehensible. Imagine knowing that you have a great purpose, something urgent, something world-changing, and spending 18 years preparing quietly rather than rushing forward before the time was right. There's a lesson there that is almost too big to hold. We also know something about the world Jesus was observing during those years. And it was not a peaceful world. The land he lived in was under the control of Rome. Roman soldiers walked the roads. Roman taxes squeezed families who were already struggling. Jewish people were divided. Some wanted to fight back against Rome with force. Some wanted to cooperate and make the best of a difficult situation, and some had withdrawn from public life entirely, waiting for a miraculous rescue from God. There was suffering everywhere. Poverty, disease, people who felt forgotten and crushed and hopeless. People desperate for something better, desperate for someone to tell them that God had not abandoned them. Jesus watched all of this. He lived among these people. He sat with them in the synagogue every Sabbath, listening to the reading of the scriptures, the promises of God, the stories of a people chosen and loved and called. He prayed. He wrestled, perhaps, with the weight of what he knew was coming, the joy and the cost of it. He walked the hills of Galilee and looked out over a land full of people in pain, people he had come to reach, and he waited for the right moment, the moment God had planned from before the world began. And then, when Jesus was about 30 years old, something shifted. His cousin, a man named John, had begun preaching in the desert near the Jordan River. John was a remarkable figure, dressed in rough clothing, eating simple food, standing knee-deep in the river and calling out to anyone who would listen. Turn away from the wrong you have done. Turn back to God. The kingdom of heaven is near. People came from everywhere to hear John. Crowds of them, streaming out into the desert, hungry for something real. And John baptized them in the river as a sign of their new beginning, a washing away of the old, a starting fresh. Word reached Nazareth. Jesus heard it, and something in him recognized that the time had come. He made his way to the Jordan River, to John. And when John saw Jesus coming toward him through the crowd, he stopped, pointed, said something the people around him would never forget. Look, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world. John, who had been boldly baptizing everyone who came to him, suddenly hesitated. He said to Jesus, "I'm the one who needs to be baptized by you. Why are you coming to me?" And Jesus said, "Let it be so. It is right for us to do this." So John baptized him. And as Jesus came up out of the water, something happened that those standing nearby witnessed with their own eyes. The heavens opened, and a voice came from above, clear and unmistakable. "This is my beloved Son. With him I am well pleased." 30 years of preparation. 30 years of ordinary life and faithful waiting. And now, in a moment beside a river, the hidden years were over. Jesus stepped out of the water and walked toward the rest of his life, toward a ministry that would last only 3 more years, and yet would change the entire human story forever. But here's what makes those silent years so stunning. Those 30 years were not wasted. They were not filler. They were not God putting the story on hold until the important part began. They were essential. Everything Jesus would do in his ministry, every moment of compassion he showed, every time he sat with someone others had given up on, every time he chose to serve rather than be served, was shaped by those years. By the work, by the waiting, by the watching, by the ordinary human experiences he gathered in 30 years of quiet, faithful living. When he spoke to a widow who had lost everything, he understood loss. When he helped a father who was terrified for his sick child, he understood fear. When he fed 5,000 hungry people, he understood what hunger felt like in a body that had worked all day. When he told stories about farmers and seeds and harvest, he was drawing on a lifetime of watching farmers and seeds and harvest. He was not a teacher who spoke about life from a distance. He was someone who had lived it, deeply, fully, right down to the calloused hands and the tired evenings and the grief of losing someone he loved. And there is something else. Jesus spent 30 years in the kind of life that most people live. Not the famous life, not the celebrated life, the ordinary life, the small-town life, the get-up-and-go-to-work life. And he honored it. He did not treat it as something to get through quickly so he could get to the real thing. He treated every day of those 30 years as the real thing, because it was. That means that wherever you are right now, whatever season of quiet you are in, whatever waiting you are enduring, whatever ordinary routine feels like it is going nowhere, you are not forgotten. The hidden years of Jesus were not a gap in the story. They were part of the story. And here is something that has moved people deeply for generations. When Jesus finally stepped into his public ministry and began teaching, the very first people he called to follow him were not the scholars in Jerusalem who had been amazed by him when he was 12. They were not the powerful. They were not the well-connected. They were fishermen, working men, people with rough hands and simple lives. People just like the neighbors he had grown up beside in Nazareth. He went to them, looked them in the eye, and said, "Follow me." And they left everything and followed him. Maybe it was something in his eyes, something in his voice, something that said, "Without words, I know what your life is. I have lived a life like yours. I understand you, and I'm telling you that you are part of something so much bigger than you can imagine." He had spent 30 years being one of them, and now he was calling them to walk with him. There is one more thing to hold on to as we close this story. The mystery of the hidden years, the silence, the lack of records, the unanswered questions, has sometimes frustrated people who want to know more. There are those who have tried to fill in every gap, who have searched for lost documents or alternative accounts, hoping to find something the Bible left out. But maybe the silence itself is the message. Maybe God is saying something in those 30 years of quiet that does not need words. That greatness does not always announce itself. That the most important work is sometimes the work no one sees. That faithfulness in the hidden place, in the workshop, in the family, in the everyday, is not less holy than the miracles and the preaching and the crowds. Jesus did not begin his ministry until he was ready, until the time was right, until God said, "Now." And in the meantime, he lived. He loved his mother. He honored his earthly father. He served the community around him. He prayed. He grew. He prepared. 30 years of roots so that 3 years of fruit could feed the world. If you are in a season right now where it feels like nothing is happening, where you have a sense of calling or purpose, but you are stuck in the ordinary, waiting for your moment, then let the hidden years of Jesus speak to you today. You are not behind. You are not forgotten. You are not wasted. You are being prepared. The roots going down are as important as the branches going up. The years no one writes about are as important as the years that change everything. The faithfulness in the small things is what makes the big things possible. Jesus knew this. He lived it. And if the Son of God spent 30 quiet years preparing before he stepped into his full calling, then your waiting is not a sign that God has forgotten you. It is a sign that he is doing something in you that the world is not yet ready to see. Be faithful in the hidden place. Grow in wisdom. Sir, where you are, wait with hope. Because when the time is right, when God says now, no force in heaven or earth will be able to stop what he has placed inside you from coming to life. That is the story of the hidden years of Jesus, the mystery of his first 30 years, the silence that speaks louder than words. If this story moved you, if it stirred something in your heart today, share it with someone who needs to hear it. You never know who in your life is sitting in their own hidden season, waiting for a word of hope. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, now is the perfect time. We bring these ancient stories to life in a way that reaches you, not just in your mind, but in your heart. Hit subscribe, tap the bell, and stay with us, because the next story we tell might be exactly what you need to hear. Thank you for being here. Until next time, keep the faith, keep going, and remember, your story is still being written.